Welcome to the Concierge Care Health System podcast. The information shared in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Listeners should be aware the content is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with a physician or other qualified healthcare provider for medical questions.
Okay, so when we talk about mental health, I think a lot of us might assume men and women, well, they face pretty similar challenges, right? Or maybe that women get diagnosed more often. But what if the data tells a really different story, a much more counterintuitive one? Today, we're diving into what our sources are calling the silent crisis in men's mental health. And just to be clear, this isn't about blame. It's really about trying to understand a systemic issue that, frankly, impacts everyone. The core paradox here is pretty striking. Men, they show lower diagnosed rates for things like depression and anxiety, but, and this is the kicker, they suffer way more from severe, even fatal outcomes. Think suicide, substance use deaths. So
it's our mission for this deep dive to try and figure out why. Why does this paradox exist? And maybe more importantly, what can actually be done about it? Let's maybe start with the numbers, because they really do paint a surprising picture. When you look at formal diagnoses, men are consistently less likely to be tagged with a mental health condition.
Globally, studies suggest something like 12.5% of men compared to maybe 13.5% of women. And here in England, for example, it's about 1 in 8 men reporting a common mental health issue versus 1 in 5 women. For depressive disorders worldwide, it's around 3.0% for men, 4.5% for women. So, on the surface, it kind of looks like men might be doing better, doesn't it? But then this sort of seemingly okay diagnostic picture, it just gets completely contradicted, violently contradicted by the data on severe outcomes. Men die by suicide at 3 to 4.5 times the rate of women globally. It's huge. In the U.S. alone, back in 2022, men were nearly 80% of all suicide deaths. That's 39,282 men. And it's not just an overall thing either. Rates are like 6 times higher for men over 65 compared to women their age. And tragically, we're seeing this really sharp spike, like a 34% increase since 2010 among younger guys, 25 to 34. And it's not just suicide. Men are 2 to 3 times more likely to misuse drugs in the U.S., nearly twice as likely to binge drink, 3 times more likely to die from alcohol abuse. That's an estimated 62,000 male deaths a year versus 26,000 female deaths.
So, if men are less diagnosed, what on earth is going on here? It doesn't add up.
It really doesn't on the surface, does it? And you're right, these aren't just isolated stats. They're deeply, deeply interconnected indicators of, a profound systemic issue. This is some sign of, superior male resilience. It's exactly what our sources call it. A silent crisis where immense suffering just goes largely unseen, and the path to these terrible outcomes, it's paved by this significant help-seeking gap. Men are just far, far less likely to access psychological therapies or any kind of professional support, really. Think about this. Less than half of men who are actually experiencing depression or anxiety will ever get treatment. Data from the NHS here shows only, 36% of talking therapy referrals are for men. And in the U.S., looking at 2021 data, only 40% of men with a diagnosed mental illness got services. Compare that to 52% of women. It's a big difference.
Okay, so that help-seeking gap is huge.
It is. And you've absolutely hit the core of the paradox. If men aren't diagnosed as much but die more, what's really happening? Well, the data showing those lower diagnosed rates for depression and anxiety, it's collected through systems, right? Systems that rely heavily on self-reporting, on people saying, yes, I feel this way. And they also rely on symptoms presenting in a typical clinical way. But if men are socialized, practically from boyhood, to suppress emotions, to avoid admitting vulnerability, and if their symptoms just don't line up neatly with those traditional diagnostic checklists, then these systems, they're fundamentally going to undercount the suffering. It's almost inevitable. So the high rates of suicide, of substance abuse, they become the tragic but kind of logical endpoint of this diagnostic failure. When you have unrecognized, untreated psychological pain combined with this cultural rule against seeking help, that pain often finds other ways out. Destructive ways.
That makes a scary amount of sense. So, okay, it sounds like we need to move past just the numbers then and really dig into the why. If it's not primarily biological, our sources seem to point towards something much more ingrained, right? Sociocultural factors, specifically this powerful, maybe often invisible force of traditional masculinity. And this isn't something men are just born with, is it? It's learned behavior.
Exactly. It's absolutely learned.
Yeah, our sources really clarify that. Masculinity isn't innate. It's socially constructed, learned and reinforced through family, friends, media, the whole cultural environment. Think about some of those key traditional masculine norms that research keeps highlighting. There's self-reliance, right? This idea that a real man solves his problems alone, never asks for help. Then there's emotional control. That stoicism thing. Suppress vulnerability. Always keep up that tough exterior. We also see a big focus on winning and status, that intense drive for achievement, for competition, and often risk-taking. Doing dangerous stuff to prove you're strong or fearless. There's also dominance and power needing to be in control, in charge. And the primacy of work, where your whole identity gets wrapped up in being the provider in your career. It's almost like boys are taught really early on that showing sadness or fear is just not okay. It leads to what some researchers call emotional stunting.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, there's a framework called the gender role strain paradigm, which is really helpful here. It helps us grasp the immense psychological tension these norms create, this masculine strain, as they call it. And it's often deeply, deeply damaging to well-being. It creates this awful kind of double jeopardy for men. On one hand, sticking to norms like emotional suppression or that relentless drive for success, that can actually increase your psychological distress. But then the norm of self-reliance at the same time stops you from seeking help. It forces men to just suffer in silence. It's a really vicious cycle.
Wow, a double jeopardy. That's a powerful way to put it. Increased distress, but forbidding to seek help. Precisely.
Yeah.
And this dynamic, it also leads to something called experiential avoidance. Think about it. Stoicism, self-reliance, even distraction tactics like overworking or heavy substance use. These are all culturally okayed ways for men to avoid facing difficult emotions. When men feel distress, they're basically conditioned to see those feelings as illegitimate or even threatening to their identity as a man. So instead of exploring them, they push them down, distract themselves, numb them out. And here's a really crucial insight from the research. These very avoidance strategies, the aggression, the risk-taking, the substance abuse, the workaholism, these are often the externalizing symptoms of male depression. In a very real way, the avoidance itself becomes the pathology.
That's a profound point. The avoidance is the pathology. So if those behaviors are actually symptoms, how does that fit with what we normally think of as depression? It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is all masculinity inherently harmful then?
No, not at all. That's where the nuance is absolutely critical. The core problem really lies in this perceived incompatibility between traditional masculinity and what we understand mental illness to be. Conditions like depression, right, characterized by maybe feelings of helplessness, vulnerability, they're seen as the total opposite of traditional masculine ideals. So admitting you have depression can feel profoundly unmanly. And for many men, that fear of losing their identity is actually stronger than the fear of the illness itself. But, and this is vital, we have to differentiate. While some norms, like really rigid self-reliance or maybe a playboy focus or power over women, those are consistently linked to negative mental health outcomes in the research. Other norms, though, like the primacy of work or the drive to win, they might be less damaging, maybe even neutral in some contexts. The specific harm really seems to come from those norms that enforce that emotional lockdown and social disconnection. Understand that nuance is just crucial if we want to create interventions that actually work, that can engage men without making them feel attacked or alienated.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that a bit more then. If traditional masculinity shapes how men experience distress so profoundly, how does that actually translate into symptoms, the ones we see or often don't see, in a way that lines up with standard diagnoses? You mentioned this idea of male-typical depression, which sounds quite different from the classic internalizing symptoms like sadness or crying.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating, or perhaps worrying, is how our diagnostic criteria, the checklist doctors use, are often heavily weighted towards those internalizing symptoms: sadness, guilt, hopelessness, tearfulness. But as we've been saying, men's depression frequently turns outward. It manifests as these externalizing symptoms that just get constantly misinterpreted. Think about it. Instead of obvious sadness, you might see anger, irritability, or aggression. A really short temper, maybe frequent outburst, controlling behavior. Then there are the escapist and distracting behaviors, like obsessive workaholism, or getting completely lost in sports or intense hobbies. Anything to avoid confronting painful emotions. Risk-taking behaviors too. Reckless driving, unsafe sex, gambling. Sometimes it's a manifestation of underlying hopelessness, other times almost a cry for help. Substance abuse is another really common one, often used for self-medication to numb the pain. It acts as both a symptom and often develops into a separate disorder. And finally, men often present with physical symptoms, things like unexplained chronic headaches, digestive issues, persistent back pain, or just constant fatigue, all masking deeper psychological roots.
So hang on. A guy who's, say, constantly irritable at home, maybe snaps at his family, and just throws himself into work 12 hours a day. He might never even be considered for a depression screening, just because he's not, saying he feels sad or crying.
That's exactly the problem. This difference in presentation is a critical reason for underdiagnosis. That man presenting with chronic irritability and overwork is far, far less likely to be screened for depression than, say, a woman presenting with persistent sadness and tearfulness, even if the underlying issue is precisely the same. And let's be really clear. Male depression isn't some fundamentally different disease. It's a different behavioral response to distress, one that's dictated by socialization. It helps explain why men who die by suicide often show fewer of those classic warning signs, like talking openly about their thoughts or plans. Because verbalizing that kind of vulnerability is prohibited by the very same social rules that are likely fueling their illness in the first place.
That's chilling. The rules that make them sick also stop them from signaling they're sick.
It's a devastating bind. And this pattern, this atypical presentation, it extends to other common disorders in men too. Take anxiety disorders. There's often a high comorbidity, a link, with substance use disorder or even ADHD. Men might be, perhaps unwittingly, using substances to try to manage their anxiety symptoms. With PTSD, the stats show men are actually more likely to be exposed to trauma combat, accidents, violence, but significantly less likely to get a PTSD diagnosis. Why? Because they might exhibit anger, aggression, or substance abuse as their main responses to trauma, which then get misdiagnosed as just behavioral problems or character flaws. Substance use disorder, SUD itself, as we mentioned, is often a coping mechanism for other untreated conditions, like depression or anxiety. And its social acceptability, even encouragement within many male peer cultures, makes it incredibly hard to recognize as a serious health problem until it's very advanced. Even bipolar disorder, which affects men and women pretty equally, often gets missed in young men. Those manic or hypomanic phases characterized by maybe extreme confidence, grandiosity, reckless behavior are frequently just dismissed as boys being boys, or typical young male behavior. This delays or completely misses the diagnosis, especially the depressive phase.
Wow, so it's a whole constellation of issues all stemming from this mismatch between male experience and, well, how we look for problems. Okay, so we have this perfect storm brewing, symptoms that often go unrecognized, and this deep cultural conditioning telling men to just suppress it all. But what happens when a man does actually think about seeking help? Because it sounds like that journey is often filled with even more hurdles. It's not just about willpower, is it? It sounds like a complex web of shame and system failures.
You're absolutely right. It's far beyond just willpower. If we connect this to the bigger picture again, stigma is arguably the single most powerful deterrent, and it operates on two distinct but tightly linked levels. First, you have self-stigma. This is the internalized shame men feel about their own struggles. They genuinely view their distress as a personal failing, a sign of weakness, maybe even a betrayal of what it means to be a man. There's this deep fear of losing respect, maybe damaging their career, or just being seen as fundamentally flawed. And that, of course, creates this vicious cycle where the distress just gets amplified by the shame of having the distress in the first place. It feeds on itself.
Right, the shame makes the original problem worse.
Exactly. And then, layered on top of that is public stigma. These are the negative attitudes men perceive, or actually encounter, from society. This is especially potent in those very male-dominated environments, think workplaces, the military, some sports cultures where showing any vulnerability can genuinely lead to ostracism, ridicule, or even career setbacks. So the fear of being judged, of facing those consequences, is a powerful force pushing them towards concealment.
That makes total sense. So it's not just feeling bad about yourself, but a very real fear of how others will react. And it really is a societal issue, isn't it? Not just an individual failing.
Precisely. It's embedded in the social fabric. And what's truly, truly alarming here, something that really pushes back against that simplistic narrative of men just don't seek help, is a statistic we have to grapple with. More than 60% of men who die by suicide had accessed mental health care services within the year prior to their death.
Wait, say that again? Over 60%.
Yes. Let that sink in. This is not primarily a story of men refusing to seek help. It is, devastatingly, often a story of men who did seek help, who reached out,
Yeah.
and were fundamentally failed by the very system they turned to. This points to a catastrophic failure not just in access, but in the effectiveness of the care being provided.
That is incredibly stark. Shocking, actually. They reached out, they engaged with the system, and still the outcome was tragic. What specifically about the system do you think is failing them so profoundly?
Well, a significant part of this failure seems to stem from these systemic and provider-level barriers. There's often, unfortunately, provider bias and a lack of gender competence. Clinicians, maybe unconsciously, might still hold beliefs that men should just man up, or they simply fail to recognize those externalizing symptoms we talked about. They might misinterpret irritability as a personality flaw or substance use as a separate issue, rather than seeing them as potential signs of underlying depression or anxiety. Plus, the standardized diagnostic tools, the questionnaires and things, as we mentioned, are often based on female typical presentations, so they might just not adequately assess men. And finally, there's a really significant lack of male-centric services. Traditional talk therapy, sitting face-to-face and exploring deep emotions. That can feel quite alienating, even threatening to men socialized to avoid exactly that. Research shows men often respond far better to approaches that are more structured, transparent, collaborative, maybe more action-oriented, goal-focused. Sometimes even framing it as coaching or skill building makes it more acceptable. But the scarcity of these tailored services means that even when a man is willing to engage, the options available might simply not be a good fit. That leads to poor engagement, dropout, and ultimately ineffective treatment. So the problem really is as much about the supply of appropriate tailored care as it is about the demand or willingness to seek it.
That's such a critical distinction. It's not just about getting men in the door, but making sure what's behind the door actually works for them. The system itself isn't set up to meet men where they are. But speaking of where they are, saying men face a crisis is true, but it's also, it's an incomplete picture, isn't it? The experience of being a man and the nature of his mental health challenges, they must be profoundly shaped by other parts of his identity, too. Our sources bring up this concept of intersectionality, right? Coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. This idea that different identities, race, gender, class, sexual orientation, they overlap and create unique, sometimes compounding experiences.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we see how intersectionality just complicates and deepens our understanding of this crisis in really crucial ways. Men of color, for instance, they often face what some call a double jeopardy. They're navigating not only those intense pressures of traditional masculinity, but also systemic racism, cultural stigma, sometimes within their own communities, and layers of historical trauma. For Black men specifically, research points to higher levels of chronic stress from discrimination, from those daily microaggressions. This gets compounded by, often, a historically justified cultural mistrust of the healthcare system. And within some Black communities, there can also be a strong cultural stigma against admitting any kind of mental weakness, which then intersects really powerfully with those broader masculine norms of stoicism. The result: when depression does occur, it's often far more persistent, more severe, mainly because it goes untreated for so much longer.
That's incredibly powerful, this idea of a double jeopardy and these multiple layers of pressure just piling on.
Right. And what's fascinating here, looking at the data, is how intersectionality reveals these really interactive effects. It's not simple addition. For white men, for example, generally, a higher income is linked to more help-seeking. They have the resources, maybe feel more entitled to care. But for Black men, some studies show a higher income is actually negatively associated with seeking help. And for Mexican-American men, there seems to be no significant relationship at all.
Wait, so higher income helps white men get help, but hinders Black men. How does that work?
It's complex, but researchers suggest factors like increased visibility, fear of confirming negative stereotypes, or perhaps different cultural expectations around providing might play a role. It shows that a factor like income doesn't have a universal effect. Its influence is completely transformed by how it intersects with race and gender. This dynamic can create unique and intense psychological conflicts, what we could maybe call toxic friction. Imagine a Black man who feels pressured to be that strong, dominant provider thanks to masculine norms, but simultaneously faces systemic racism that actively denies him access to those very opportunities in that status. That creates a specific, really toxic psychological conflict that's not experienced in quite the same way by white men or by Black women.
Toxic friction. Yeah, that captures it well.
And this intersectional lens, it applies across so many other identities, too. Think about LGBTQI plus men. They face these compounded stressors of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, which lead to significantly higher rates of mental health challenges like depression, anxiety, suicidality. Though interestingly, some research suggests that Perhaps due to navigating identity challenges, sexual minority men might actually have more favorable attitudes towards therapy sometimes. Age is also critical. We mentioned the highest suicide rates among men over 85. They might adhere more rigidly to traditional norms, face intense loneliness, physical decline. But we also see those sharply rising rates among younger men, 25-34. They're facing very modern pressures. Economic instability, precarious work, navigating rapidly evolving gender roles and expectations. It's a different kind of pressure cooker. Veterans, of course. That hypermasculine military culture creates immense barriers to seeking care for the incredibly high prevalence of PTSD, depression, and anxiety in that population. And finally, socioeconomic status, unemployment, financial instability, intense work-related stress. These are major triggers, particularly because, as we said, a man's identity is often so deeply, deeply tied to his role as a provider. Losing that role can be devastating.
It's clear this is just incredibly intricate. So many layers, so many interacting factors, which can feel a bit overwhelming. But what do our sources say about pathways forward, about healing? How do we start to build some bridges to better health for men, given all this complexity?
You're right, it is complex, but the good news is our sources do offer some clear pathways. It really boils down to a two-pronged approach, essentially. We need to reform clinical practice, how therapy is actually done, and we need to build up robust, effective community-based programs. Which raises that important question. How can we build a system that actually serves men better? The need for adaptation in therapy itself is just crystal clear. Men often respond better, as we said, to those structured, action-oriented, goal-focused approaches.
Right. So what does that look like on the ground in the therapy room?
Well, it means really focusing on male-tailored psychotherapy. Sometimes it starts with something as simple but powerful as adapting the language. Framing therapy as coaching or consultation or skills training that can significantly reduce the stigma. It aligns better with those masculine ideals of self-improvement, problem-solving, competence. Then there's male-tailored cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. It's already structured and goal-oriented, but you can adapt it to explicitly incorporate how traditional masculinity might be influencing a man's thoughts and behaviors and work with that. We see online programs like Man Therapy, for instance, using humor and a kind of manly persona. They're showing really promising results in engaging men. Other approaches like internal family systems, or IFS, can be really powerful too. It allows men to kind of externalize their emotions as parts, like an angry part or a vulnerable part, which can help them engage with their inner world with more curiosity and less judgment. And strength-based approaches are also key. Instead of just focusing on deficits, you leverage existing masculine values. You might reframe strength as the courage to actually confront difficult issues, or frame seeking help as taking responsibility for one's well-being for the sake of family, sometimes called relational heroism, using existing values as a bridge.
Using their own values as a bridge. I like that.
Exactly. And finally, underpinning all of this is provider training. It needs to be mandatory. Gender-sensitive, culturally competent, and crucially, intersectional training is imperative. It helps clinicians recognize their own biases, understand male-typical symptom presentations, and learn these tailored approaches. Programs like Men in Mind in Australia, for example, have shown they significantly increase clinicians' confidence and competence in working effectively with men.
So it's about making the clinical setting itself more accessible, more relatable, more effective for male experiences. But what about solutions outside the clinic walls?
Yes. That's where the power of community-based support really comes into its own. And the absolute standout example here is the men's sheds movement. It started in Australia, but it's a global phenomenon now, and for good reason. How it works is actually quite brilliant in its simplicity. These are community-run workshops, often aimed initially at retired or unemployed men, but attracting a wider range now. Men get together and work on practical projects, woodworking, metalwork, fixing bikes, restoring furniture, you name it. The focus is squarely on the shared activity, on skill sharing, on being productive, all within a safe, informal, and distinctly masculine feeling environment.
So it's not explicitly about mental health.
Not usually, no. And that's the genius of it. Crucially, it operates on what they call a shoulder-to-shoulder principle. Personal conversations, mutual support, even discussions about health problems. They tend to happen organically and indirectly while the men are working side by side on a project. It completely bypasses the need for that direct face-to-face emotional confrontation, which, as we know, can be a major barrier for many men.
That is such a clever approach. It leverages their natural inclinations, how men often connect, rather than forcing a different model onto them.
Exactly. It works with the grain. And the benefits. They're really well documented. One UK survey found something like 89% of members reported decreased depression. That's huge for a non-clinical program. Other studies consistently show reduced loneliness, improved sense of purpose, enhanced self-esteem, better overall well-being. Men's sheds successfully complement the formal healthcare system by providing this vital preventative mental health support in a way that completely avoids the stigma of being labeled a health service. What's truly fascinating here, looking across both clinical and community approaches, is that the most successful ones often work by reframing and rechanneling certain masculine ideals, rather than demanding their outright rejection. They tap into those positive masculine values, purpose, action, camaraderie, practical skills, and create contexts where those masculine-aligned behaviors actually lead directly to therapeutic outcomes. They work with certain aspects of masculine identity, not entirely against them.
Okay, wow. So this deep dive, it's really revealed a profound truth, hasn't it? This silent crisis in men's mental health. It's not some biological given. It's a complex, socially constructed tragedy. It seems rooted in these restrictive norms that just warp how pain gets expressed and create these massive barriers to care. And that leads to these devastating, literally life-costing outcomes.
Absolutely. If we connect this all back to the bigger picture, we've seen how this systemic failure operates at so many levels, from those deep sociocultural norms shaping our very understanding of emotion, right through to clinical misdiagnosis and systemic failures in care, and how it all gets further complicated and intensified by intersectionality. But the crucial thing is, we also have clear recommendations, things we can actually do. For public health, we absolutely need to champion, fund, and scale up these effective community-based programs like men's sheds. We need gender-sensitive public awareness campaigns that normalize male typical symptoms, that help redefine strength to include vulnerability in seeking help. For clinical practice and education, it seems imperative to mandate that gender-competent, culturally aware, intersectional training for all mental health providers, focusing specifically on these male-tailored models we discussed and actively promoting and sharing these effective approaches much more widely.
Right, real concrete steps.
Exactly. And maybe this raises an important final question for you, for everyone listening to consider. This crisis in men's mental health is really, at its absolute heart, a crisis of connection. Connection to emotion, connection to self, and connection to others. The culture of silent suffering, the one that has cost countless lives. It's not a sign of strength. It's actually a profound barrier to strength. The work ahead, it really involves dismantling this culture, replacing it with one that understands that true strength lies not in just stoic endurance, but in the courage to acknowledge vulnerability, in the resilience to face pain, not just ignore it, and in the wisdom to seek connection and healing when we need it. Addressing this crisis isn't just about improving health outcomes for men, that's vital. It's actually a critical step toward fostering healthier families, more compassionate communities, and ultimately a more equitable and humane society for absolutely everyone.
Concierge Care, providing world-class, personalized care for patients and members. Taking a proactive approach by offering its free digital health clinic for anyone in need of these services. Reach out to us via our website, www.health.conciergecare.net, or give us a phone call at 786-809-2345.